All right, if you want to head back to your chairs, that would be great. All right. We did forget to mention that we are having a potluck afterwards in honor of the graduates and in honor of the Atkins, and they brought some pulled pork sandwiches and different things. So if you'd like to hang around with us after the service, we're going to have a great celebration. All right. Well, we're in the third week of a sermon series looking at the story of Joseph, and this isn't Mary and Joseph, right? This is the Old Testament Joseph, and in case you've missed anything, allow me to kind of summarize the story so far. Jacob, even though he was one of the youngest, was the favorite, not Jacob actually, I started the whole thing wrong. Joseph was the favorite of his dad, Jacob, even though he was the youngest, or one of the youngest, and his older brothers resented him for that. They hated him for it, actually, and in fact, Joseph is eventually betrayed by his brothers and sold as a slave and taken off to Egypt. So we've seen in our stories so far that he's really enjoyed some sour moments in his life, right? As we've been talking about lemons, and these lemon things keep showing up. And not a cool looking lemonade stand? Someone ought to use that for a lemonade stand sometime. Anyway. But even as we saw last week, there's worse parts to it. His brothers even convinced his dad that he was dead. I mean, these guys were rotten, weren't they? And the last we heard of Joseph was from Genesis 37, verse 36. It says, "Meanwhile, the Midianites, who had bought Joseph from his brothers, sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard." And so that's where our story begins this week, that Joseph makes it safely to Egypt. And now we're going to see what happens there. And this is where the Big City skit crew comes in. They're going to come up and act out a story for us. And just like last week, kids, we're going to have a review time at the end. And if you answer a question correctly, you'll get a prize. So be paying attention to the story. That's a new robe for Joseph.
Might belong to someone else.
Ah, Joseph, you are to be congratulated for your promotion to head of all that Potiphar owns in his household. You have found much favor in our master's eyes.
Yeah, it's just an honor to have, a good, to have the master's trust and to be, respected in that way and be in charge of all the important things he needs me to do around here.
Yes, and this robe he has given you is quite splendorous. Yes,
Yeah.
It befits a man of your status.
Barely, but but yeah, isn't that nice? Like, man, it's pretty cool.
Yes. Well, I must warn you. Mrs. Potiphar is quite partial to young men in fancy clothes.
Oh, I was gonna ask about that, but I didn't really want to say anything.
All I can say is that I recommend you never ever be alone in the house with her. Sir, I think everything will go well as long as you are never, ever alone in the house with her.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I must leave you in the house alone with her. I have to go clean the stalls.
Young, strong, muscular man I was looking for. Do I have a job for you?
Are you sure you don't need some other guys? I could go get that other dude that was just here. Like, I could get a few. I'm not really that strong.
Don't be silly. Look at these pythons. I wish they would just squeeze me.
Yeah, they're really not like pythons. They're more like little baby snakes or even worms or something. You know who has huge pythons? Your husband, my master, Potiphar. He's really strong. Ooh, burly man, that guy.
You know, I really like your new uniform. It looks so soft. Is it soft?
Yeah.
Oh, it's so soft. I could just feel it all day. Oh.
Well, why don't you just hold on to it for me? Because, yeah, that way you can touch that and not me.
Joseph.
Oh, did you have a job for me that you wanted me to do?
Oh, yes. I needed someone to try my new lipstick out on.
People need to stop giving me robes as gifts. They're ruining my life.
He's going to regret that.
All right. Pretty crazy story, right? Hopefully that's somewhat familiar with you. So let's kind of just work through some of the details. Let's look at the first part of the story this morning. In Genesis chapter 39 is where we're at. And beginning with verse 2, it says, "The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything that he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care, with Joseph in charge. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate." So again, I asked the question earlier. Have you ever met anyone kind of like Joseph, where he just seems to be good at whatever they do? They just, whatever they try, even if it's the first time they try it, they do it better than you do it. I mean, it's just, I've had a couple friends that are like that I've grown up with, and have to admit that I'm a little jealous of them at times. But, you know, especially in sports situations, I have to admit I also like to have them on my team, right? If they're a really good athlete and they just seem supernatural at things, you want them around, right? I mean, have you ever been there before? Have you ever ran into someone like that? Well, this is how Joseph was for Potiphar. Joseph was the slave coming in, just some Hebrew nobody, right? And it didn't take long for Potiphar to realize that this guy had some talent, right? And he was really good at managing things. Now, we know the reason why he was gifted in the way that he was. We've been reading the story, and you see it repeated over and over and over again. And it seems like, just tracking through this, verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered. Verse 3 says the Lord gave him success in everything that he did. Verse 5 says, from the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. How many times do you have to repeat it, right? We get it. The Lord, the Lord, the Lord is what's happening here. And even Potter figures it out. In verse 3, when his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. And why not, really? I mean, if you were Potiphar and you saw this guy and the talent that he had, this God-given talent, that everything that Joseph touched, it just seemed to work. There was success. I mean, I would put him to work, wouldn't you? And I think that's how things should work. When the person in charge notices someone with talent, right, that really could help the team out, the business out, whatever, they allow them to use their talents. But crazy as it is, in the world that we live in, that isn't always how it works out, right? With human nature, sometimes the person in charge, when they see talent like that, they feel threatened by the talent. They feel threatened. They envy. You know what envy is? Envy is feeling threatened or jealous of someone because they are talented, because they are gifted. And envy and jealousy can take take control of a person. And rather than being thankful for the gifting of other people, they can, again, become envious. Case in point, Joseph's brothers, right? Why wouldn't they actually want him to be a part of the family because he's so talented? Why would you try to push the guy away? I mean, they felt so threatened by Joseph. You contrast that with Potiphar. Potiphar, he didn't feel threatened by Joseph at all. He didn't envy him. He trusted Joseph. In fact, we look at Joseph being sold into slavery as this sour moment in the life of Joseph, right? I mean, what a terrible moment to have to go to Egypt all by yourself. He's all alone. And then he gets this situation where he gets to use his gifts. And I'm thinking, really, is this a sour moment in his life? Because do you think he would have ever got that kind of opportunity back at home? No way. Not with his brothers around. They weren't going to allow him to do anything. They envied him. But who were they really hurting, really, by not allowing Joseph to be Joseph, to use his God-given abilities? They're hurting themselves, right? In fact, I think that envy should be on the list of things when you're looking at ways to squander your potential. That really should be on that list, don't you think? And it's amazing how often envy, this word envy, it's a 4-letter word, and the Bible mentions it all over the place. Look at Titus chapter 3 with me just for a moment. Paul provides this, really a couple different lists of, with some good insights on how we should live or not live for Christ. And let's start with the list that we shouldn't be. Verse 3, it says, "At one time we too were foolish, we were disobedient, we were deceived and enslaved by all kinds of passions and pleasures. We lived in malice, we lived in envy, being hated and hating one another." I mean, that's quite the list, right? Don't you want to sign up for that kind of life? How do these kind of people approach life? They are being ruled by something, as Paul talks about it in here. They're being ruled by their passions. They're being ruled by their pleasures. In fact, it says that the passions and pleasures deceive them, enslave them. I mean, isn't it interesting that the Bible would actually make passions and pleasures kind of into a person that does things, that can trick us and enslave us? In other words, if you look at passions and pleasures and you decide to allow them to be your boss, allow them to be maybe even your God, they're going to cause you all kinds of trouble. And doesn't it seem that our culture has kind of bought into that thought that you know, follow your passions, follow your pleasures. They should dictate who you are and what you do. Live after your passions. Live after your pleasures. They would tell you that is how you should live. Live into them. Find your pleasures. Follow them. And so some of you are probably thinking, well, Pastor Brian, are you telling us that we shouldn't have pleasure in our life? That we shouldn't have passions? Well, no, not exactly. Many of our passions, many of our pleasures actually are God-given, right? And they actually help us as we try to figure out God's plan for our life. We find things that we like to do, that we enjoy doing, pleasures. And those are great things for us to do. The issue really is here that this idea of boss, passions and pleasures shouldn't be the boss. And if you're pursuing and discovering passions and pleasures while you're pursuing Christ, awesome. But if you're going to pursue them at the expense of God's ways, not so good, right? Now look at the rest of the list that we see in that verse. Look at the rest of the list and you'll discover what life looks like. Allowing passions and pleasures to be your God. People who pursue passions and pleasures, they end up disobedient. And why would they listen to anyone else, right? They're after their own path. They're after what they want. I only listen to my passions. I only listen to my pleasures. And then it says malice, which is planning evil against other people. And then envy, being threatened by their gifts. And they don't mind being hated and hating everyone. It's kind of interesting, these relationship things that come into a person that's pursuing pleasure, problems. Why do they have so many problems with other people? Because other people become competition to them, or at least a roadblock from getting their way, because they assume that everyone's doing the same thing. We're all pursuing our own way, and if you're trying to pursue your way and I'm trying to pursue my way, then if they have any conflict, my way should win, right? I'm the one that should be getting my way. I don't care if you get your way. I want my way. And you could probably, as you think through how these people would treat each other, you'd probably maybe add the word paranoid to them because they think that everyone's out to get them. And it just doesn't sound like a life that would be very exciting to live. Now, I'm not saying that pleasure is bad. Again, pleasure is pleasure, right? The word's in itself. There's nothing wrong with pleasure, just as long as it's not your boss, just as long as it's not the one defining what you're about and what you're doing. If pleasure is what you define as the most important ingredient in a good life, if you're defining what a good life is, you're probably going to get ruined by pleasure. Don't believe me? Do you know any addicts in your life? Do you know a drug addict? Do you know an alcoholic? Do you know a porn addict? Do you know anyone who is willing to do anything that's available to them if they can get 1 second of pleasure out of it? I mean, do you know a meth addict? I mean, it's just not logical when you look at the impact that meth has on people's lives, but they're still willing, just for that moment of pleasure, to take it on. Why not? I'll get pleasure out of it. It's just not logical. Pleasure is such a bad master. And what does the world look like where each of us are individually going after pleasure, and we don't care how it might affect anyone else in our lives? Well, we see examples of that everywhere. And it's not pretty. In fact, you might even look at this group in downtown Seattle if you want a great example of what life looks like, everyone pursuing their individual pleasures. Now move on to the second list. Beginning with verse 1, it says, "Remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready to do whatever is good, to slander no one, to be peaceable and considerate, and always to be gentle toward everyone." That's an interesting list as well, right? There's some things in there that we might not agree with. This subjecting ourselves to rulers and authorities, that could be a little bit sticky, right? Especially in this day and age. But think about the whole list. Look at the whole list that we see there in Titus chapter 3. The overall feeling of these two verses is this: let's be on the same team. Let's work at this together. Look at it again. I mean, if you look at the passage, let's not feel threatened by order. That's the subjecting ourselves to authorities. Let's not be afraid to cooperate with each other. That's willing to be obedient, right? Willing to do good for others. Let's not look for ways to knock someone else down. That's not to slander them, right? Let's be able to have peace with other people. Let's be willing to consider others. Be willing to be gentle with everyone. Do you see the difference between those two lists? One is focused on me, and more me. As long as I get my pleasure, I don't care what happens to everyone else. And the other is the opposite. As long as I'm able to invest in the good of others and really help benefit them, you know what? If I give up a few of my rights, if I give up a few of my pleasures to get there, it's completely acceptable to me. I'm good with that. Do you see how completely opposite those perspectives are? And this me, pleasure-centric mentality, it infects us in all sorts of different ways. We've been walking through this phrase, when life gives you lemons, right? Make lemonade. And isn't it our normal definition of a sour moment when we're not experiencing pleasure? Isn't that how we define what a sour moment is? When we don't feel pleasure? But what if pleasure's not the barometer that we should gauge life situations with? Then how do we define a sour moment? If pleasure's not in the picture, how would we define a sour moment? It gets pretty tricky, right? To even think through that. Think about this. What if God could so transform our hearts so that we would gain our greatest satisfaction, not on passions and pleasures, but on living into God's ways, no matter what that brings into our lives, good or bad? We wouldn't care who we were serving. We wouldn't care who we had to love. We wouldn't care about any of that, as long as we could live into the center of God's will for our lives. I mean, can you imagine if that was our approach to life? What would that look like in your life individually? What impact would that make in your family, in your church family? If we all did this, if we all looked to the benefit of other people and to their good, it would be huge, even for our community, if we're all working for the better good for each other. And this is the impact that Joseph is making in his community in Egypt. This is why God was able to use him in incredible ways. He didn't care if he was having pleasure. I mean, he's a slave, right? This is the perspective of Joseph. Think about his situation. He's a slave working for an Egyptian master. And if you're basing your life on pleasure, good luck with that, right? And if he was all about himself, what would he do? He'd just sit in a cell, right? He would try to do as little as possible. He would have held back his gifting from Potiphar, right? I mean, think about it. Why would I do anything for someone who thinks he owns me? This is Joseph. Slavery is wrong. I could even see him say, Jewish lives matter, right? He could have let that thought rule his life. But instead, Joseph seems to just be naive enough to think that God's going to take care of him no matter who he loves on, no matter who he serves, even if he's willing to serve and obey his earthly master. In fact, as we'll read in a moment, he actually thinks that God wants him to obey and serve his earthly master. That's a little bit countercultural to where we are today, right? And I'm not saying that this would be easy to not stand up for yourself, right? This is tough. And there are times in history where God does have people stand up for themselves, does have people stand up for the value of human life, right? But this is not one of those. There is something so much bigger going on in this story, way bigger than that. That God was on this rescue mission to save this whole region of the world from starving to death, right? That's the end story. And Joseph is going to have to be willing to sacrifice some things if he's going to cooperate with God's plan. Of course, the caveat to that is he doesn't even know the plan exists. He doesn't know what God's up to, right? He's just choosing to obey. And who else does that remind you of? Didn't Jesus do something similar, willing to sacrifice everything to save the world? He could have stood up for himself, right? He could have chosen to do whatever he wanted to, but he chose to die for us instead. And I'm thankful for that. The question is this: could we be willing to follow God's plan even when pleasure doesn't seem to be part of that plan? Think about that. Would we be willing to follow God if we knew it didn't bring any pleasure to us? Could we gain satisfaction from doing God's will instead? Could we do that? Well, the rest of the story this week is about testing Joseph's resolve to live into God's ways, to live into God's plans. He's got this choice that he's made to follow God's ways, and you know what happens when you choose to follow God's ways? There's this enemy that doesn't like that very much, and so he tries to break up the plan by causing Joseph to fall, right? Verse 6, now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you're his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against him?" So Joseph has decided to live into this life, right? Live into this responsibility that he's been given. this trust that he's been given. And just because he's a slave, he doesn't just obey everyone's orders, right? Because he doesn't obey her orders. Morals and the ways of God do matter. The relationship that he has with his master does matter, right? Relationships are important. But think about the other perspective that we looked at in Titus that we just read. What if Joseph was living into a pleasure-centric thought process, who didn't care about the order, didn't care about people? What would that person do in Joseph's place? We all know what that person would do, right? Live for the moment. Hey, pleasure's the only thing that matters, right? And besides Joseph, Potiphar owes you. Look at all the good things you've done for him. He owes you that. And she'll probably be able to keep a secret. And she wants it anyway. I mean, come on, Joseph. Take advantage of this opportunity. Hate and be hated. Let your passions rule. I mean, can you imagine? It's pretty easy to justify that when you go down this path of pleasure is everything. And it wouldn't be too difficult to think through that. Now, at this point in the story, you got to introduce this T word, temptation, right? What makes temptation tempting? What makes temptation tempting? It's because it's something that we want, something that we desire. I mean, if it wasn't tempting, it wouldn't be a temptation, right? James 1 says it this way. But each person is tempted when they're dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. So this Greek word for enticed, it's interesting because it goes back to the Edwards ways of doing things. This is about baiting. This is about catching things by bait, right? It's all about fishing. And when you're thinking about fishing, what are you trying to do when you're trying to catch a fish? Well, you're trying to pick something to use as bait that might look tasty to a fish, right? And every fish is a little bit different, and what they're feeling, what they might be feeding on that day. And at least with fly fishing, you want to know what kind of bugs that they're eating on already, because they've already got a flavor for that. They want that, whatever they're feeding on. And so you pick a fly that matches the real thing, what they've been feeding on. And you know, inside that tasty-looking thing, is it tasty? No, it's a hook. It's dangerous. So the bait is just the facade of the real thing, right? You're trying to bait the fish and then hook them. And what's interesting, I really think that we give the devil too much credit at times. And yes, he's dangling things out there to try to get us to take the bait, but where does the desire for that bait come from? Well, as we just read in James 1, it's our own desire. It's what we wanted. That's why it's enticing, right? All he's doing is grabbing something that we already struggle with. Now, if we're already bought into this me, pleasure-centric approach to life, how vulnerable are we to pleasure? It'd be everything to us, right? Our whole life is geared around pleasures. Think about it. If we define our good moments and sour moments based on the level of pleasure that they bring or don't bring to our lives, if we're going to base everything on that barometer, how often are we going to have sour moments? All the time. We're always going to be too short of pleasure, I think. We always want more pleasure. And because it would be our go-to sugar, pleasure, we'd be completely vulnerable to anything coming at us that would bring us pleasure, right? So that would be a pretty easy fish to catch, right? In fact, if you think about that, if you're a pleasure seeker and and someone's willing to put that on a hook and stick some pleasure out there for you to cook, to eat, right? You're no longer fishing. You're catching. You're going to bite on pleasure if that's what you're about. And the devil knows this. He knows that we're not invincible to temptation. So if your temptation is pleasure, you're in deep trouble, right? Stay too close to the fire for too long, you're going to get caught. You're going to get burned. And Joseph knew this. Genesis 39, verse 10. And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, He refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. And we'd probably do pretty well ourselves if we did the same thing with temptation. If there's something in our lives that we struggled with, run away, right? Don't even be near it. You're going to get caught. And we see that even as you're trying to keep yourself clean, you're going to run into some trouble because life is life. Verse 11, one day Joseph went into the house to attend to his duties. None of the household servants was inside. Oops. Potiphar's wife caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Now, this was not a moment to reason with her, right? Joseph does a great thing by running away from her. It's not a time to say, "No, I don't want to do that," and just keep doing your job. It's run, right? But he doesn't get off that easy, because as he runs away, he's created an enemy, and she now goes after his throat. Genesis 39, verse 13, when she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." So what's she doing? She's playing the damsel in distress card, right? And it usually works, doesn't it? And this is the second time, as Joseph mentioned in the skit. This is the second time that he gets in trouble because of his coat. Everyone knew it was Joseph's coat. Must have been some unique coat that he had this time too. And so she doctors up this evidence. Verse 16, she kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story, "That Hebrew slave which you brought us," what's she saying? "This is all your fault. You brought him here, right? Came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. So you see the details, right? You've had those type conversations. If when she says his master, not her husband, and when she says your slave, not our slave, right? You just kind of notice some of those cues as a man that you're in deep trouble, right? And now his master ends up burning with anger. The devil thinks he's won. Thinks he's got Joseph exactly where he wants him to be. But who is the anger actually aimed at? I would have to ask that question. Was it really Joseph that he was angry with? Well, I don't actually think so. Think about it. Potiphar, if he really believed the story, would have executed Joseph on the spot. No questions asked. Just would have taken him out. And if you ask me, I think that Potiphar burned with anger because he knew what his wife was up to. And he was angry about it, not because she was up to it, but because this is Joseph. This is the guy that's been taking care of everything and doing a great job with it. And now he's looking at the prospects of losing his guy, right? That's what would make Potiphar angry. And you see what happens next. Verse 20, Joseph's master took him, put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. So Joseph is falsely accused. He's thrown into prison. This is another sour moment for Joseph, right? At least if it's based on pleasure. But what if it's based on being in the center of God's will? Could it be possible? I mean, think about it. Joseph's done everything right in this situation, and we see that God actually has his back. The second part of verse 20, but while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness. He granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Same old story, right? Do you see the response of Joseph? Yes, he could have decided to just quit. I mean, he tried the good way, so now that he's thrown into prison, let's just give up on this good stuff, right? But he chose to continue to trust the Lord. He chose to continue to engage and use his gifting, and he was rewarded for it. He was able to move up the ladder just like he was at the last place he was at, because the Lord was with him, right? And we will soon find out that this prison of the king's prisoners, where Joseph ended up in, was the place that he had opportunities to build connections with Pharaoh's people, right? So again, this broken record continues. Joseph keeps investing his gifts, and God continues to thwart the plans of those who try to do evil to him. And isn't it odd that prospering for Joseph does not equate to being removed from the difficult situation? In fact, when you think about this story, his imprisonment is his reward. He avoided death. He got an opportunity to make connections, make contacts. Would you ever believe that being wrongfully imprisoned could be a blessing? And we can't forget that Joseph doesn't know the end of the story. The story that he's looking at looks like, you know what, I've been hated by my brother and sold into slavery, right? I've been falsely accused by my boss's wife after I've done everything right. And now I'm sitting here in prison. Yet he continues to trust in the Lord. Could you do that? I'm not sure if I could do that. So how about you? How do you gauge whether the Lord is with you? How do you gauge to know that you are being blessed by God? Is it as easy as we think it is? Is it just about pleasure? Or could God be blessing us when difficult things are happening? Could that even be a possibility? I mean, if you're like me, if I'm thinking about living into the ways of God, I sure hope His plans for me are grand, right? I want to be a part of something big, right? And yet, much of our lives is really about choosing obedience in these places where they look awful ordinary, right? Not sure what's going on, just a part of the journey of life. Nothing quite as bad as what Joseph had to go through, but still a whole lot different than maybe what we'd hoped for in the very beginning. And yet, similar to Joseph, do we really get to see the end of the story? Do we know what kind of impact that we're making in our lives? Some of us won't know the impact of what we've done, the investments we've made in other people, until we get to heaven. Yet we still have these opportunities to choose to live for Him in the ordinary and sometimes difficult journey of life. What role do you think pleasure takes in our lives? Is it the thing that we pursue more than anything? Or is there a better thing to pursue? Would you pray with me? Lord God, your word is just amazing. It's amazing how relevant the stories that we find in Scripture, how much they challenge us. And what a great story of Joseph this morning. Forced us to look at pleasure for what it is. It's just a bad master, something that we really would do well to not use as our king. But instead, maybe use some other barometer in our life. Maybe our desire to follow you in your ways. Pleasure or God's ways. Help us to choose your ways. Would you help us to be willing to obey even in the ordinary, even in the difficult? Lord, you are so faithful. You are so trustworthy. You are so good. And we see that even when Joseph seemed to be in the darkest of places, you were there with him. And you helped him to prosper. You helped him to be successful. Maybe not in the ways that we would like to see ourselves successful, Lord, but Lord, would we trust that your ways are higher than our ways? That your thoughts are higher than our thoughts? And truly believe that whatever you have for us is good for us. Is good for us individually, but is good for us as a people. Help us to live into what you have for us. Help us to be satisfied with you. Would you help us to do that this morning, Lord? We'll give you all the praise. In Jesus' name, amen. I do end as we close the service this morning. Our benediction passage is from 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 22. Flee the evil desires of youth and pursue righteousness, which is God's ways, right? And then faith, life with God, love and peace, along with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart, which is those who are on our team, the people around us this morning, right? People of God, let's continue to trust the Lord no matter what we encounter in life. Can we do that? This week, choose to be satisfied with God. Choose to be satisfied knowing that we're right where we need to be with God. Flee the evil desires, pursue His way of life. And let's just look for God's blessings wherever they may be found. Okay? You are sent.